good afternoon. Welcome to the Self-Build Hour. I'm Jenny Chandela. I am your host today and an architect and self-build expert with Allen Corfield Architects. We are filming here live from the NSBRC today. There's quite a lot of activity, so if there's a bit of noise in the background, that will be the reason. As you know, we have started this Self-Build Hour as a way of bringing information to you at a convenient time and in a convenient location. We are filming live today, which for those of you who are here today and joining us live, you'll have the opportunity to ask our expert questions using the Q&A button at, within the meeting screen. You can just type those in as the talk is ongoing, and then we'll review them. And after the talk, we'll then host a Q&A session, which allows you to ask those questions. For those, this is also being recorded today. So for those of you who weren't able to join us live or want to go back and revisit the information, that information will be posted to the website shortly after today, and you'll get an email link letting you know that has gone live. So without further ado, I am going to introduce today's speaker. We are being joined by Michael Holmes to tell us about sort of common self-build mistakes. A lot of people out there are very nervous. A lot of people who are about to approach a self-build project may hesitate because of those mistakes. But one of the great things about this forum is that we can talk about the things that need to be planned before you go live with your self-build, and how you can consider as many possibilities as possible. There's always going to be something, and give you a better chance of responding those and have a much more successful self-build. So Michael Holmes, as many of you are going to be aware, is the director of content for Homebuilding and Renovating magazine. Apologies. And I think it's safe to say that he's one of the UK's leading property experts. He's worked on numerous projects, including 2 of his own self-builds. And he's also going to be a familiar face to many of you who follow those property shows on television. You may also be familiar with his written work, both for the HBR magazine as well as his book, Renovating for Profit. It's fair to say he's had enough experience to have learned from mistakes made on self-builds. And he's here today to share that knowledge with you. Right, with that, I will let you take over the screen, Michael.
Thank you very much. Let's see if I can just get myself, and there's the full screen. So welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining me for this session on some of the most common self-build mistakes, and hopefully how you can avoid making the mistakes that so many other people make along the way, and invariably with the impact on budget and on program, those classic 2 elements that we all see on grand designs and other self-build programs, whereby, you know, if you think of a number, double it, and if you think of how long it's going to take to build, again, double it. That needn't be the case if you follow the advice that I'm going to give you now over the next half an hour or 40 minutes. What you're seeing on the screen there are my own projects. So I have self-built from scratch twice. I have also done some major renovation projects, and I am now involved in helping everybody who wants some help through the industry as an expert at the shows and through the magazine and homebuilding.co.uk, the website. But also I work as a building contractor and developer, so my extensive experience goes well beyond my own self-builds, and it's fair to say that I still continue to learn. After all of these years, there are still mistakes to be made. There's always new challenges in the building industry. And so if you do come across some challenges along the way, just remember it's the nature of the industry. It's something that happens to absolutely everybody. I've already had an introduction. So I am content director on Homebuilding and Renovating magazine, amongst many other roles that I take on. I've been doing that for now well over 30 years. So where do you start? What are the mistakes to make? Well, one of the biggest mistakes a lot of people make is approaching their project in the wrong order. And the correct order, actually, counterintuitively, is to start with finance, especially for those of you who haven't yet bought a building plot. Arranging finance and knowing just how much you can access and how much capital you got yourself is fundamental. A mistake I made, although it was a fortuitous mistake, on my first project was to not have my loan agreed in principle, and I bid for what was a barn conversion. And the time it took me to get the funding in place, I actually got to the point where they rang up and said, "Look, we've run out of time here. Somebody else is bidding. If you up your bid by £1,000, it's yours. If not, we're going to move on." I wasn't able to confirm because I hadn't got my funding in place. I lost the property. It turned out to be a good thing because just a few weeks on, a plot came up, by which time I did have my funding in place and I could move quickly. Basically, the great opportunities go very, very quickly. You need to effectively be a cash buyer, even if that means having a mortgage agreed in principle as part of being ready to go, because you need to make decisions very, very quickly on a plot, or you will lose those best opportunities. That is the stage at which you find your building plot. That comes second. I always look closely at the feasibility and the development assessment of any project to make sure the whole thing stacks up financially. It's really important that you do this before buying the building plot. So that means getting into place an idea of what it's going to cost to bring the building services in place, what it's going to cost to build overall, and what the other costs are going to be. So you do a broad budget, making sure, we'll talk about in a moment, some of the mistakes that people make and some of the costs that they typically forget to include. Get a broad brushstroke for what your total global costs are going to be, and then make sure that the end value of that project stacks up. So it's very sensible to do that and not just jump in head first and hope for the best. Design and planning are next stage, and that is followed by detailed design. And something, again, we're going to look at more closely later on, is that design, the real design process, only starts after you've got planning permission. And a mistake a lot of self-builders make is thinking that the design process ends with submission of planning. That is only stage one. The real work comes in place when you've got your planning permission and you have to start developing the design detail. And that's not an area to compromise on costs. And then comes the build. So approaching the project in the right logical order is the starting point to avoid the typical errors. I next want to talk about planning permission. Now, anybody who's searching for land will find there are a lot of properties on the market that appear to be a building plot, and especially those that appear to be good value, typically do not have planning permission. Now, most self-builders are not going to be in a position where they can afford to speculate and buy a piece of land that does not automatically have planning permission. If you're a property developer, if you're a planning consultant, if you're used to the development game, then you can take an informed view as to whether there's genuine hope value attached to a piece of land, whether it's worth making a bid, knowing with confidence that you're likely to get planning permission, probably using what's called an option agreement, which is an agreement to purchase it. That's basically an exchange of contracts with the vendor usually. So you've locked in the vendor subject to securing planning permission. It's not the sort of thing that, as an ordinary self-builder, most people will engage in. What you're really looking for is a piece of land that already has planning permission. That's a building plot. The one exception I would make is if you're buying a house that already has an existing dwelling, and there is therefore a presumption that you'll be able to replace that dwelling, and it's as good as planning permission. Remember, planning permission can lapse. So we're going to look at the details now. Having a planning strategy is really important. Again, a cost that people don't necessarily want to take on board is the cost of a planning consultant. But a planning consultant can be a very, very sensible investment. They can unlock potential that you might not be able to unlock yourself. Do not assume that your architectural designer is a planning expert. That's a common mistake that people make. They assume that whoever's doing their design work is a planning expert. Now, there are plenty of architects and architectural designers out there who are also experts in planning, but it's not necessarily the case. And especially when you're dealing with a more complex application. So if you're dealing with something that's in the green belt, or if you're dealing with something in a conservation area or adjacent to a listed building, something that's going to be more sensitive, or if you're really pushing the boat out with your design and trying to produce something that is a little bit less conventional, then the help of a planning consultant can make all the difference and be a very, very wise investment. Do consider a pre-planning application. Again, I would take advice from your architectural designer and consultant as to whether this is worthwhile. In some instances, there is little benefit in putting a pre-application in, but if you do have the time in your program and you haven't already committed to necessarily buying it, a pre-app can be a good way of getting a good indication of what is likely to get planning permission, but bear in mind it's not binding. And if you're only going to get a junior inexperienced officer for that pre-app meeting, then the value of the information and advice you get may be fairly worthless. So take a view on it. It's something you have to pay for now. If you get the right person, it can be invaluable. If you get a junior officer who won't commit, it can be a pointless exercise, and you may be better off putting in a planning application and using that effectively as a pre-app, because you can always withdraw. An application in England is currently £578 for a single dwelling. That will vary in Wales, Ireland, and in Scotland. They're all devolved and can set their own planning fees. Typically, once an application is validated, it'll take 8 weeks to get a decision. Bear in mind, though, that the validation process itself can take some time. And so if you're in a hurry, you really need to make sure that you've satisfied every condition. So you can actually download what the validation requirements are for each local authority and make sure that you've included all of those requirements. And that way, once you get to the front of the queue, which is typically 2 or 3 weeks, your application will be validated and your application gets backdated to the day it was submitted. If you're missing information and your application isn't validated, you could find the clock starts from once your application is full and complete. Permissions last for 3 years. So even if you're looking at a plot that's got planning permission, do check out when it was granted and how long it's got left. You don't want to buy a plot where the planning has lapsed or is about to lapse. In most instances, providing planning hasn't changed, the local plan is still valid and the rules haven't changed and the MPPF hasn't changed, then there's a good chance you will get planning again on that piece of land. But in some instances, the planning could lapse and there can be a risk involved. So do check the duration of the planning permission. Be aware that existing planning permissions can be amended, but there's various ways of amending it through non-material alterations or material minor amendments under what's called Section 73. Bear in mind that they do not reset the clock. So you could have an application that's 2 years down the line. You could vary that to get a scheme that you want to support, and providing it's broadly the same as the existing consent, you might well get it through on Section 73, but it doesn't reset the clock for 3 years. You've only got the remaining period of the planning application. So that's a mistake you do not want to make. And remember that new permissions can run concurrently. So you could apply for a completely new scheme on the same piece of land. That does not overrule an existing permission. That will still run for the full 3-year period. Outline permission is an option where a piece of land doesn't come currently with planning permission, and you decide you're going to go for an outline consent to get permission in principle. It's less expensive and you don't have to provide the full design detail. It's not appropriate for all situations, but it can be a good way of getting a relatively low cost indication as to whether a plot is proceedable. If you're in a conservation area or a built up area, the likelihood is the planning authority are going to want to see the detail of what you're proposing, and that way you really don't have the option of an outline consent. Full planning permission, that's when you go in for detailed consent. So all of the information pertaining to the appearance of the building and other relevant information goes in at the same time. If you hear of a outline planning permission that has had its reserved matter submitted, that's the detail you have to provide in order to be able to build a outline plan permission. You have to provide what are called reserved matters that'll be detailed on the outline consent. That information then becomes equivalent of a full planning permission or a detailed planning permission. If you hear those terms, they are effectively the same thing. Planning permission is not the end of the line. It doesn't mean just because you've got planning you can start building. And this is a mistake a lot of people make. They do not look at the small print. They don't read the detail. Planning permissions typically have a whole list of conditions. Some of them are just fulfillment conditions, things you have to comply with, or compliance conditions. Others have to be dismissed and complied with prior to commencement. That will be detailed in the permission. Others have to be discharged prior to getting out of the ground. Do not breach planning conditions. It is part of the planning application. If you do, there's no guarantee you'll be able to discharge conditions later, and there is a risk you could actually invalidate your planning permission should the local authority take a very hard line. Section 106 contributions. This is something that are applied locally and will be detailed in the planning permission. So make sure if your planning application includes a 106 contribution, typically it'll be for affordable housing, you're aware of that and you're aware of the sum and that you budget for it. It could be a commuted sum payment. There can be a number of different contributions. It could be for infrastructure. It could be for affordable housing, as I mentioned earlier. Bear in mind that these are in addition to the community infrastructure levy, the SIL. Now, with SIL, there is an exemption for self-build, providing you assume liability, providing you then apply for the self-build exemption, and providing you then also issue a notice of commencement. If you miss any one of those steps, you can become liable for the SIL. If you miss the notice of commencement, you can certainly become liable for a fine. It could be a very big mistake that could prove extremely expensive. So look into the details and make sure you get your self-build exemption from SIL. As for the Section 106 contributions, as things stand, they could still apply. You are not automatically exempt as a self-builder. So if the planning permission has been granted with it, then you have to accept that. Since earlier this year, new housing has become subject to biodiversity net gain rules, and there can be very significant payments that have to be made. Now, there is an exemption for custom and self-build. So if you're buying a plot that has a BNG payment attached, you must make sure that you are going to get the exemption for custom and self-build. That might well mean varying the planning permission to ensure you aren't trapped in a very expensive BNG contribution. Being realistic about costs is perhaps the biggest mistake that self-builders make. Over-ambition, over-optimism, it can lead to becoming very unstuck later on down the line. So associated with finance, it's not just the cost of buying the building plot. There can be costs of arranging finance. If you're running two mortgages in parallel, one for the build and one for your existing house, take into account the interest costs. Don't forget stamp duty and land costs, as well as any other fees that are attached to arranging your finance. You need to insure the plot the moment you buy it with public liability insurance. Don't forget to allow for professional fees, particularly fees related to a site survey and ideally a site investigation report. If you're going to predict costs accurately, then it's a false economy to not instruct site investigation surveys. A cost that is very often omitted and forgotten from a budget is the cost of bringing in utilities. Those are the building services, and some of those have got very, very expensive. So if you're looking at a dream plot like this, you might not pay a huge amount of money for it, but what you save in the cost of acquiring land in a beautiful remote spot, you can easily pay for in the cost of creating access, a long driveway, the cost of bringing water, power, and internet over that sort of distance. Obviously, with internet now, you've got the Starlink option, which can be done remotely. Drainage, there's almost always a remote drainage solution. Water, you could, in many situations, drill a borehole, but power, something that is still almost certainly going to require a connection to the grid. Off-site generation is possible, but it's still expensive and not 100% reliable, even with battery storage. So the reality is you should at least be thinking about bringing in electricity to even the most remote site. So that's a cost you need to take account of and don't leave till later. Ideally, if you can find out that information before you bought the plot, you can take it into account in the plot purchase price. Another cost that's very difficult to predict is getting out of the ground. So it's fair to say that once you've nailed down the specification, all of the above ground costs can be predicted with the assistance of a quantity surveyor. Getting out of the ground is something that until you've actually dug the hole and built the foundations and got your oversight in place, you do not know 100% what that cost will be. You can help massively by doing trial holes, inspection, and actually getting your structural engineer out to take a look at the ground conditions and give a good idea of what the type of foundation required will be, and then you can go out and price that. But until you actually dug the hole, there can always be hidden problems in the ground. So that's an area where the more research you do up front, the more likely you are to achieve accurate costs. Similarly, the build cost per square metre, that will vary enormously depending on your location, access to the site, the scale and complexity of the build, the number of stories, but also your build route. So broadly speaking, the lowest costs you see published in the magazines will be DIY self-builders, where they're doing an awful lot of the labor costs, saving a lot of labor costs because they're doing a lot of work themselves. The next cheapest cost will be the DIY project managers. That will be closely followed by those who are doing a shell build with the project manager overseeing the builder contractor seeing up to shell stage, and then you taking over from there. Then comes the self-managed main contractor, followed by handing over the whole thing to a professional project manager. So be aware that your build route will massively influence costs. So trying to pin that down early on is important, especially when it comes to briefing your architect, so that you can make sure that you design something that you can afford to build. I mentioned earlier doing a feasibility study. This is where you do your cost value analysis. Having taken into account all of these costs, you can make sure the whole thing stacks up financially and that the end value of the property is going to justify the project. Common oversights that people make, these are where people come unstuck: failing to take those site surveys and soil tests up front to allow you to reasonably predict foundation costs and design your drainage solution. Temporary accommodation, an easy one to forget. If you're selling your current home, you're going to need somewhere to live. I lived 3 times with my family during my 3 projects, my in-laws. By the 3rd project, we got 3 kids and 2 dogs. We lasted about 6 weeks. We ended up having to rent, and I hadn't budgeted for that. So, be realistic. Yeah, by all means, crash on the floor with friends, family, neighbors, wherever you can save money, live on site in a caravan. But bear in mind, you still got to turn up to work. Still got to look smart, still got to keep your relationships intact. It's not going to suit everybody. So take that cost into account. Utility connection fees, I mentioned earlier, that's one that a lot of people hope for the best on, put a round number on, but actually getting the real costs early on is super important. Planning and building regulation fees is an easy one to forget. I always recommend that you put in a contingency fund. There are always unexpected costs, and getting out of the ground is often one of them, as I mentioned earlier. So perhaps put a bigger contingency in, and then you can start to free that up as the project progresses, and perhaps can start to spend a bit of that money on some nicer fixtures and finishes. Landscaping is one where, again, people hope for the best, and quantity surveyor won't necessarily take into account your full landscaping costs. It is quite a significant cost as an overall proportion of your budget, typically 15 or 20%. So again, it is something that can follow once you finish the build. My first build, I just about managed to get it finished to move in, but I didn't have the money to complete the drive until we decided to sell it a year later. If you can possibly ring fence the money in your budget, it's much nicer to live in a house that's fully landscaped. And I'd managed to turf it. I just couldn't afford to surface all of the drive. There are compromises people are willing to make. You just have to, if you know them up front, they're a decision you can make as opposed to one that's forced upon you. Interior fixtures and fittings, hopefully most people remember to include all of those costs, but lighting, light fixtures and fittings is something that's quite easy to forget. Waste disposal, something that's very often forgotten. Those grey areas, the cost of moving waste material in between the trades, the cost of moving materials between the trades, and the cost of waste disposal, skips and muck away, is something that, especially if you're preparing your own budget, it's very easy to underestimate. A builder will include them under what's known as prelims, and that's an area where the DIY project manager often comes unstuck. For prelims, I'm afraid it's those elements of cost like scaffold and muck away and site welfare for which you see no benefit. Allow 10% of your overall budget. So if you're preparing your own budget, make sure 10% is tucked away to cover those unexpected costs. Professional services, again, don't forget that as well as your architectural design fees, you're going to need an engineer, you might need a drainage designer, you might need to bring in other specialists as well. I said earlier, invest in design. It's a false economy to try and park design at the planning stage and just have a building regulation service. The more information you produce at the drawing board stage, the more accurate your build will be, the more cost efficient your build will be, and you've got a much better chance of building to program. Your design brief must include the following: your available budget, super important, something a lot of people forget to mention. The key characteristics of the site, so the orientation, topography, aspect trees, they will all influence the design. Interestingly, some of the best designs are a response to some of the most complicated sites, providing that information is made clear in the design brief. Don't forget both your current living requirements, but also your future living requirements. If this is a long-term home, it's quite easy to forget that your needs and the needs of your household will change over time. Put together a visual design guide of what you'd like to achieve architecturally, but also from an interiors perspective, and a guide to what you want in terms of external materials. And that's particularly important if you're living in an area where there are particular constraints on your choice of external materials as a result of planning conditions. And for instance, if you're building in a stone belt area, there's a very good chance you're going to need to build in stone. That needs to go into your design brief. So again, that cost can be taken into account. Another important factor is your approach to sustainability. Do you want to build a zero carbon house, or are you willing to compromise and just achieve the building regulations to reduce costs, or somewhere in between? Any other special features you want to incorporate for hobbies, get those into your design. Anything you've already got that you want to reuse from your existing house, again, make sure that's on the design brief so it can be incorporated. Chosen build route, we talked about the impact on costs earlier on. If you're going to be a DIYer, make sure your designer knows that and design something that's going to be relatively simple for a DIY self-builder to construct. Remember, the design process only really stops post-planning. Don't take on too much yourself. True DIY self-build, you're responsible for everything from finding the land through to project managing through to all the building work and home ownership. It's a massive thing to take on. Yes, it's a huge cost saving, but don't underestimate how much work it is. Self-procurement might be better for a lot of people, where you still buy the land and manage the project, but you hand on all the construction work to subcontractors. That could be a halfway house where you have a shell build, so a main contractor builds a house to shell stage, say a timber frame, and then getting the cladding and the roofing on, the groundworks and drainage done. But you then hand over to your own plumber, electrician, plasterer, decorators, etc. And then self-commission is the easiest route, really. You buy the land and then you hand over both project management and construction to third parties, whether that's a main contractor or whether you actually hire a professional project manager to oversee the build for you. Something that's very important you understand early on is the eternal triangle. Everybody wants a super high quality build for the lowest cost, and they want to be in by Christmas. They want a really speedy and fast build. Unfortunately, you cannot have all three. If you really want to drive quality but drive down cost, you're going to take a long time to build that project. If you want to build it really quickly and still need to drive down cost, you are going to compromise on quality. Really, if you want to have a good balance, you need to be somewhere in the middle there and find a good balance between maintaining quality, controlling costs, but being realistic about time frame. If you push any one, it is going to impact on the others. If anybody finds a magic way to achieve all three, come and see me and we'll get very rich together. Planning ahead and talking to builders early is really important. So when you talk to builders, once your planning application is in, they'll know you're serious. Leaving it too late and you're not going to find any builders. Realistically, good builders are always going to be busy. They probably aren't going to need to advertise. They work purely from word of mouth and they're going to have a very busy order book. So you need to be talking to them well in advance, at least the moment your planning application goes in. Try to work through recommendation, personal recommendation, membership of FMB. Make sure that that's the Federation of Master Builders, incidentally, of which I'm a member. Look for specific experience on projects just like yours in terms of scale, quality, and detailing. Check their turnover. You can check this online for a small fee. Make sure that you hit the sweet spot, that your project's not too big for them to be able to manage it in their turnover, and make sure you're not too small for your project not to matter to them. So matching the right scale builder is super important. Do consider that shell option where they build to a weather-tight shell stage and then you step in and save on costs by building out yourself through project management or DIY or a combination. Check their references. It's an easy one to forget. And a lot of people are reluctant to do it, but do go and speak to previous clients. Do go and see their work. Do not jump to take the cheapest quote. It's always a false economy. People who come unstuck, it's usually because they took the cheapest quote. There's no magic way to build for less money. It's just most likely there are omissions, or they just priced it on the back of a fag packet, didn't pay a quantity surveyor to do a proper takeoff. They cannot build it for nothing. They cannot build it and lose money. They'll just go bust. So if it seems too good to be true, it's because it is. So the more information you invest in up front at the design stage, the more cost certainty you will achieve. Really develop the design. If you need to get on site and your builder's available, you haven't fully developed the design, then do consider having a proportion of contract design with a prime cost contract with a fixed margin. This is a great and very flexible way of working. If you haven't nailed down everything, you can basically, the whole thing is a series of change orders effectively, but providing it's a reliable builder, and you've got a really good element of trust in there, you could certainly do a proportion of the build on a prime cost, even if it's from shell stage onwards. It's something to consider. If you're going to go for competitive tender, go out to at least 3 contractors, but you do need to have a full tender pack. That really means investing upfront. The quotes will only be as accurate as the information you provide them to quote for. The more grey areas you leave in, the more vague the quotes that come back will be. Employing a quantity surveyor to do your own takeoff and issue a bill of quantities is a really great way of making sure that what you issue to builders to quote against ensures that when they quote, you get a like-for-like comparison. They're quoting for exactly the same bill of quantities. That way you've got a really good tender proposal that makes it very easy. Don't ignore health and safety. DIY self-builders managing their own projects, you're still creating a place of work, and health and safety requirements still apply. It's a false economy, even if you're not finished, if you're not thinking of selling the project, if you're planning this as your long-term home, it's a false economy not to take out structural latent defects liability insurance, and that's called a warranty. It's even, you never know what's around the corner. You might need to sell, and you won't sell without having a warranty in place, or at least architect certificates. If you want to be able to make sure that any future buyer can use any lender, then a warranty is really important. You can get a warranty now that bolts onto architect certificates. That's the alternative to a formal warranty. Public liability insurance, I mentioned earlier, you need that in place the moment you purchase your plot, because anybody breaking in who injures themselves might well come after you if you haven't made reasonable attempts to keep them safe and keep them out of the site. If you are going to go ahead with the contractor, make sure they have sufficient cover for your project, and do expect to see a copy of their insurance certification. If you're managing the build yourself, you need your own self-build site all risks insurance. A false economy not to do that. You could be very vulnerable. Be aware, I mentioned earlier, that your site is a place of work for your subcontractors, and therefore health and safety laws and CDM, Construction Design Management 2015, applies. And as of earlier this year, Part 2A of the building regulations means you must appoint a principal designer and a principal contractor. You can get your principal contractor to take on the role of designer as well if you aren't retaining your architect or architectural designer through the build phase. One thing you must as client issue is the pre-construction information. This is a pack that you give to the contractor at the tender stage that sets out all of the health and safety details relating to the site, the scope of the project, distance to the nearest hospitals. There's a whole list of basic information that you must provide as part of your tender pack. Remember, if you're a DIY self-builder managing the project yourself, you are the building contractor, and therefore you must provide all of the welfare facilities, rest areas, site fencing, health and safety notices that there's a construction site and for the public not to enter, first aid facilities, and for a big project, fire strategy as well. Top 10 tips, top 10 tips now to try and wrap up. Top 10 tips for success. That is a bit of a tongue twister. Never risk a plot without buying planning permission. Some of these plots seem fabulous value and they tell you planning's pending. It's a huge risk. It's not for the ordinary self-builder. Checking costs in advance is super important. The more work you do up front, the more accurate your budget will be, the less likely you are to have a budget overrun and come unstuck later on. Don't be overambitious and take on too much yourself. There's no point in thinking, the budget doesn't quite stretch to it, so I'm going to do loads of work myself on a DIY basis. If you've got a full-time job, family and social commitments, be realistic about your time, the skills you've got, and what you can bring to the project. Your priority should be the client and keeping ahead of the decisions. If you don't do that, you will actually derail the build and you won't be able to get the efficiency out of your builder and subcontractors. Work with people for whom reputation matters. Now, this is super important. I talked about checking the previous clients of builders, but this also matters for designers, everybody. Check out their previous clients, check out their, and make sure that, ideally somebody that's recommended to you by family, friends, someone you trust, somebody who relies for their reputation on, somebody who relies for work on their reputation, will not want to mess you around, because they'll get around and they won't have any more work. Always get more than one price for everything, not just builders. Builders, merchants, shop around. Just because you're getting a deal from a merchant on some items doesn't mean they're going to be cheapest on everything. So shop around, there's huge savings to be made. Do make payments on time. You know, there will be in your contract, formal contract, there will be a payment schedule. You expect builders to turn up on time. You expect materials to turn up on time. They expect you to pay on time. If you slip, don't expect them to turn up. What fair is fair. Stay ahead on all the key decisions. Remember, you know, that's super important. That's your number one role, being client ahead of being a DIYer. And try not to change your mind. It's your prerogative as the client to change your mind, but believe me, it always costs money and delays the schedule. So don't imagine that changing your mind doesn't have an implication on when you're going to be finished and how much the project's going to cost. Always allow contingency in your budget. I mentioned that earlier. 10% is a minimum to hold back, especially when you're getting out of the ground. A tip that is really important to look into the VAT: do not pay too much tax. On a self-build, everything should be zero rated. So do not pay VAT on labour or materials supplied by a VAT registered contractor. If you are employing non-VAT registered subcontractors, make sure they don't supply any materials, because you won't get the VAT back. You have to supply those materials yourself. You will pay the standard rate of VAT, but if you keep all of those receipts, you can make a claim at the end of the project to ensure that you benefit from the same zero rate as a developer or a major house builder. And finally, a good piece of advice for anybody who's watched Grand Designs: I think they almost pick people to feature who've got a medical condition and a shaky marriage and financial problems. You know, check your finances. Don't expect a build project to help your relationship problems. You know, go in with a strong relationship, because believe me, it will test it, as it will your health. Thank you very much for listening. I've talked about a lot there, but if you've got any questions, I am now going to be available to hopefully answer them.
That's lovely. Thank you so much, Michael. I was jotting down my own top tips as you were talking, but you've done such a lovely job summarizing them for us. So I think that will provide, I think, some reassurance to a lot of the people who are on this call and listening, and who may be listening in the future. To know that you're going to make mistakes along the way. There are ways to sort of think ahead about those mistakes, and planning and being organized from the outset is one of the top ways of making sure that you can sort of shield yourself from some of those mistakes, but then also having an appropriate contingency. So when things do arise, you are able to deal with them appropriately.
Absolutely right.
So we have had a few questions that have come in. One of them has to do with SIL, and the person who's asked this is wanting to know if it applies to renovations as well as self-builds.
Yes, it does. So the exemption for self-build also applies for extensions. There is a slightly different box to tick, but yeah, residential extensions also are eligible for, as long as it's your main home. So there are plenty of criteria here that people need to be aware of. It needs to be your main home to be eligible for the zero rate. So if you're building a holiday home, then and not going to be living in it, then you probably won't get the exemption. But if, for most self-builders, you know, it's your main home, and you have to remain living in it for a period as well. Otherwise, there is a clawback.
And along those same lines of renovations, but not quite financial as much. If you're doing it, how much of it, and you're getting subbies in to do a lot of the work, but you're acting as the principal contractor effectively, how much health and safety do you need in place in terms of warranties and insurance? Is it similar to a new build project?
It is exactly. Building site's a building site, whether you're self-building or doing a renovation. If it's your site and you're effectively taking on the role of building contractor, then you are liable for all of the rules of CDM, and you have to treat it as a place of work for your subcontractors. And so you need employers' liability insurance, you need public liability insurance. I would definitely recommend you also insure the site for site risks as well. So if somebody breaks in and steals your kitchen the day it's installed, or the day it's delivered, more likely, or if anything else goes missing, or you have damage to the site through flood, fire, etc., you are fully covered. So yeah, basically, if you're a DIY project manager, you're the main contractor. So see yourself as the builder, and you're responsible for health and safety. So make sure you've got a first aid kit on site as well, for instance. It's slightly more more relaxed than it is a professional, but I'd still treat it with the utmost seriousness.
Yeah, can I just jump in there, Jenny?
Yeah,
actually,
of course.
Just, hi, Mike.
Hi, like to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. Just on that, another thing on the insurances, if it's a renovation, if it is your current house, just update your current provider, because as soon as it becomes a building site, there's as Michael alluded to, there's a higher risk of theft, but there's also a higher risk of fire and damage to that house. So they'll put a premium on. It's not difficult, but get that added in. And again, another follow up to that, just on the CDM, it's one of my bugbears in the industry, that it just isn't given the weight that it is in terms of the implications if people don't actually follow through with it. So you have a requirement under CDM 2015 as a client. As soon as you know there's going to be more than one contractor on site, it falls in. So your whole point of CDM 2015 is pushing the liability onto others, right? That's the easiest way to think of it. And if you don't do that, a proportion of that sits with you. Do not presume that your architect is your principal designer. We provide it as a service to all our clients, but it is an additional service, and it's a written service, and it's formally appointed. HSE do not accept I presumed somebody else was doing it when they're sitting in front of you. If somebody has come to work on your site and had an accident, it's a criminal offence. So take it with the care and the amount of demand that it needs, right? But the whole point is to pass it on to your principal designer during the design stage, and they'll pass it on to the principal contractor during the actual work of the thing. And it's all about mitigating risk, planning, monitoring for the risk during the design, during the build, and during the maintenance of that house. So it's vitally important.
Exactly. And it was saying that it's a service that you should expect to pay for. It's not something that comes for free. And my strong advice to every self-builder is to pass on responsibility for CDM to a principal contractor or a principal designer.
And just a follow thing, if an architect if you're speaking to an architect at present and they haven't mentioned this to you as a chartered architect, they are failing you instantly. So we have a duty of care as soon as we meet and speak to somebody to raise these risks. And as I say, it's a bugbear with mine within the industry that it's not picked up and it's not given, and it's leaving potential self-builders. And HSE had a period of grace maybe 10 years ago with self-builders. It's not the case anymore. It's you are treated as somebody. Yes, you're not treated the same way as a contractor is, but you are doing a project and there's enough information out there.
And if you weren't to be retaining your architect to oversee the build, which of course everybody does, Alan, in your case, I'm sure. If you aren't retaining the architect through the construction phase 5 and 6 on the REBA schedule of works, then I would strongly recommend that you make sure the role of principal designer is taken on by your contractor, so they can also take on that role as well. But again, it's something that has to be acknowledged and formalized. Don't just assume.
Yeah, exactly. There was another one. There's one coming, Jenny, actually on the chat rather than the Q&A. Yeah. How are you finding current market rates for self-build at the moment? There's a big question.
So obviously it depends on where you are in the country, but I have seen significant increases in construction costs since COVID. It has leveled off now, I'm pleased to say. And, I think the rate of inflation has flattened off. Sadly, it never seems to go backwards. I mean, I think material prices did calm down a little bit on timber and so on. But I would say that a sensible place to start budgeting for using a main contractor would be in the sort of 2,250 per square metre up to 2,750 a square metre. That's a starting point. It's a very, very broad brushstroke.
Yeah, agreed. And a lot of it depends on how long is a piece of string. There's so many different things that are involved in that. How efficient the design of the house is from a structural point of view, from a build system point of view. Have you got cantilevers? Have you got curves? Is there embellishments in terms of specification? Is it a sloping site? All of these different things come in to raise that cost per square metre over and up and up and up. And I think, as you're right, it's definitely seen a levelling off. but it has unfortunately priced some people out of the market, because there's just maybe not that headroom there in the end value once you've taken the plot and everything else. But I
think we've seen house prices very flat, and construction costs go up, and so the cost savings are at one of the lowest points I've seen them. I do think that will reverse. I think everybody's predicting house prices now to start to catch back up over the next 2 or 3 years, and build costs should remain flat. And so that margin that we talk about, the typical 30% saving that the average self-builder makes, which historically is remarkably accurate and consistent, will definitely be squeezed right now. But I expect to see it return over the next 3 years, where costs remain flat, but house prices go back up to restore that developer margin. It's not surprising you're not seeing not many developers build houses at the moment, because they rely on that margin to make their living, and it's not there at the moment.
Yeah, no, exactly. I just wanted to go back on one of your key points, or the key mistakes that people make early on once they've found that plot, is not investing in some investigation works in terms of the ground condition. And it's one of the big things that we see. We take a lot of projects on later on in the stages. We've got the unique blend of architecture and engineering within house, so we're sort of uniquely positioned to deal with that. But that soil investigation study, which might be anything from £600 to £2,500 for a full borehole soil investigation study, is vitally important. If you're going to be spending 100 to £400,000-500,000 for a piece of land, and you do not know what the ground conditions are, you cannot budget the below the ground bit. And if you've only got a 20 or 15% contingency, that might be blown out of the water before you get out of the ground. And if we go from, take an example of the same size and style house on a very stable flat site to something that's clay with lots of heave on a slope or whatever, that same foundation could cost £40,000 difference. That could be your contingency completely gone. So please invest in that before you buy it. And again, if you've gone through that option agreement, or you've put a deposit down, or you've got an exclusivity agreement on it, most of our clients condition their purchases with suitable ground condition, and also getting their planning approval. That is just, it's so vital. It's
not just for engineering on structural engineering for foundation design, but civil engineering for drainage design.
Yes.
So the ability to be able to discharge the stormwater from your roof and surfaces into the ground, you won't know until you do infiltration testing, BRE 365. But more importantly, perhaps, if you're looking to do an off-mains drainage solution, you need to be able to discharge the effluent somewhere, the treated effluent. And so you need to be able to access the watercourse, or have sufficient ground, if you can't access the watercourse, to be able to have a drainage field. There are extreme instances where a site may not be viable. So, if you're remote particularly, I think that's when it becomes absolutely essential that you predict what those costs, that we predict the ground conditions and the infiltration.
Remote tight site, you're really struggling. Remote tight site with the wrong porosity, you're really struggling to be able to fit everything in terms of attenuation and soakaways and things. So no, that's really good advice.
A very technical detail, but don't assume that there's a ditch on the boundary of your site that you have a right to discharge into it either. It's something you want to agree upfront with the owner of the ditch, because you need the right to be able to discharge. If it's part of the public highway and on the edge of the road, then you're going to be fine. But if it's privately owned land and you're planning to discharge into it, it's wrong to assume you have the right to do so. You'll need an easement for the right to discharge from the landowner. That's something you want to sort out upfront, rather than at the end, where you cannot complete your house and occupy it without that right to discharge, and you've got no opportunity to come up with an alternative solution.
It becomes a very expensive mistake. And I think, just leading on to that, or following on from that, you have a good description of the different types of sites and the approvals that they might have. One of the common mistakes we see is somebody that's purchased an outline plan, a site with outline planning, but not reviewed the conditions. An outline planning may be as simple as a red line boundary with a statement saying there's principle to support a dwelling. They might have shown an access, but they've not agreed any of the detail. And the same scenario of trying to connect into drainage ditch, trying to connect onto a main highway where you don't own the boundaries of the site, and the visibility display, it might have been done on the site plan might have been done on an ordnance survey map that might be accurate to plus or minus 5 meters in the countryside, and they've not done a topographical survey, they don't know their boundaries, that it says in the outline, well, we've got an access, but actually the detail of that might need visibility displays down each side, 30 or 50 meters, that you physically can't do. And it's not the planner's duty within an outline planning application to put the conditions in there that you can actually discharge. So really, really check if you're buying something with outline and full planning that actually the conditions that are attached to it are that you can actually deal with them.
A couple of points to add to that is that just because you've got planning permission for an access, don't forget that you also need permission from highways. So in addition to planning permission, highways have to consent to the drop curb and the detail of that drop curb. And the other one is that, there are quite a lot of legal checks alongside the access that I would make right at the early conveyancing stage, and one of those is to make sure that there are no restrictive covenants on the land that would prevent you from building out and having to make a payment.
No, all good advice. And I think one thing just to finish on before you summarize, Jenny, is just that we're all Jenny's sitting in the NSBRC, which is a permanent 55,000 square foot advice centre effectively, and myself and Michael are off to Somerset this weekend to speak at the Homebuilding and Renovating show, is just to make sure that you guys that are on the call, that you're becoming as well educated as you can, because a lot of these mistakes, there's guides, there's videos, there's blogs, there's courses that you can go on that will talk you through these mistakes and show you how practically to eliminate them. So I think that there's good architects, there's bad architects, there's good clients, and there's bad clients. Like, be the best you can be. Spend the time up front to learn and get educated. Come to the show this weekend. Get a magazine subscription. Come along. Get as much as you can. I think one of the big things that we always look at is Mark Brinkley's House Building Bible. There's a couple of really good books out there that will, if you're in the self-build journey, that you can just read cover to cover and become as good as the experts that you're working with.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. It was a really interesting conversation at the end between Alan and Michael. And I usually close with my top tips, but as mentioned earlier, I thought Michael did a great job on summarizing his own presentation, as he would. So what we'll do is we'll send the email out with his top tips. But absolutely, the educational components and opportunities for you, taking those advantage of those at early stage is really critically important. So I did have a slide up here, as Alan mentioned. The HBR show is taking place at the Bath and West Showground. That is this weekend, 16th, 17th November. We also have some self-build seminars that we host here at the NSBRC in Swindon, and both those are good opportunities and good reasons to travel. You're going to get a lot of information and networking and probably a few more questions will pop up. You'll get a lot of answers, but you'll also get more questions, and that ability to keep asking questions and dig deeper and deeper is just going to help you and benefit your self-build. So we will be joined next month by Brian Singleton. He is the Technical Sales Director of ADM Systems. So that talk is same time, 1 o'clock on Thursday, the 13th of December. Once again, it's live and recorded. If you can come to the live, you'll be able to ask questions, and that's all about mechanical ventilation and heat recovery systems. So please do join us for that. Thank you very much for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you again next month.